Hi, it's John Murphy, and welcome to another podcast in the Winning Teams series. Today's guest, it's a double-hander. They're a married couple. They're successful lawyers in their own right. It's Andie Kramer and Al Harris. But we're not talking to them about matters legal. We're talking to them about a subject that they are passionate about and that they've been advocates for many, many years. And that's the role of women in the marketplace. They have authored two books in that space. One is called Breaking Through Bias, and the other one, It's Not You, It's the Workplace. So they really are experts in that space. And we're talking about the challenges facing women in the workplace. And it's also a challenge for men. It's not just about women, it's always about men, but it's also a challenge to organizations of how they go about that. Because, despite a lot of noise over the last, going on 50 years about women in the workplace, we really, really have made very, very little progress when you look at the leadership teams, across the globe and the representation of women on those leadership teams. So, despite the noise and despite everything, we've actually made very, very little progress. So who should be interested in this podcast? Well, really anybody who's leading a business or a team should be interested because, it's not just an issue for women, it's an issue for men and organizations, as I said previously. But why is the topic so important? Well, apart from the obvious, if you're not dealing with this issue, you're simply not doing your job, because your job as a leader is about developing people and it's also about optimizing teams. But there are also very good commercial reasons why you should be interested, because research has definitely proven that teams where you do have that gender mix are more effective, are more productive, and produce better results over a longer period of time. So there are very good, sound commercial reasons why you should listen to this. But during the podcast, Andie and Al also very, very good tips, give very good tips to women, how they should be behaving in the workplace and how they should think about themselves and their roles in the workplace. And also the same for men, and also how organizations should be dealing with this and not just doing it as many organizations do, which is just a bit of a box ticking exercise. So how organizations can really, really make a difference. So if you're looking for more leadership tips and you're looking for more leadership help, then go to my website, www.johnmurphyinternational.com, and there you can download my short book written so that it can be consumed over lunch. And it's the 10 key traits of top business leaders, which will give you a lot of insights as to how you can really grow your leadership skills. But in the meantime, sit back and enjoy this very, very interesting interview with Andie and Al. So, Andie and Al, thank you so much indeed for coming along on the Winning Teams podcast. I'm delighted to have you here, and I'm looking forward to this. It's a great joy to have you to talk about a subject that is very close to my heart.
Well, we're very pleased that you've invited us on.
Glad to be here.
It's great. I mean, I said it's a subject that's very close to my heart, and we're chatting beforehand. I mean, I coach a lot of women executives, I say very senior level, and I find it a fascinating issue. And it always fascinates me because, and as a father of three daughters as well, it's another reason it's close to my heart. But what always fascinates me is that, if you look at it from an educational perspective, I mean, girls are outperforming boys certainly in Europe, I'm more aware of than in the US, but they're outperforming boys kind of right through the education system, then into kind of university and college system and beyond that. And then it just seems to go horribly wrong when we get into the corporate world. Why do you think that is?
Well, we don't have any hard information, but we have a theory. It is precisely because women and girls are outperforming men in the educational sphere that I think that the men build up a fair amount of resentment They don't like that. They don't like to be shown up. And once they get into a male dominated sphere, namely the corporate world or even the professions, they have an opportunity to band with other men and to protect their turf. They are in a position where they can say, I've had enough. I'm not going to be tread on by these women anymore. I'm going to hold them back.
Now, that of course suggests that it's a conscious effort, but obviously this is not, wouldn't be in most people, it's not conscious. But the reality is that we have various biases, and one of them is that we like to hang around with people like us. So when women and men start in the corporate world, what happens is the men identify with the in group because that's predominantly who the leaders are, and the women are really an out group. And so that starts a segregation and a difference in the way that they're perceived and the opportunities that are available to them. So it could be a combo of both, frankly.
I mean, I think it's fascinating because when you think of, powerful women that we hear of, and and irrespective of your politics or what you stand for, but you think of women like Sheryl Sandberg, you think of the likes of Michelle Obama, Melissa Gates, in Europe, you think of somebody like Angela Merkel, who's been a real powerhouse politically, women like Oprah, who've been huge influencers, in a global sense. But yet, when it comes to the meeting room and the boardroom, that doesn't quite follow through. And is it because of that, subconscious bias or fear that men have? Is it about that? Is it about the men?
Well, we don't think it's about the women. We think that women get a bad rap very often. There's a whole series of books out there sort of trying to fix women, saying that they need to be more assertive, or that they need to be better negotiators, or that they need to be this or need to be that. We don't buy into that. We think that women are fine just the way they are. But what is the problem is what Andie mentioned. It's the biases and the stereotypes that most people have. And they are that women should be and are punished if they are not gentle and kind and modest and deferential. And when women behave in a more assertive way, when they are speaking their mind, in that corporate environment, they are often viewed with distrust and dislike. They are seen as abrasive rather than as forceful and powerful. And so it's a real trick for a woman to be seen both as likable and as forceful and as a leader.
So we call that the Goldilocks Dilemma, which is that women find that if we're nice and kind and sweet, then people like us and they're happy to put us on the library committee. But if we're in your face, you do this and you do that, and I need this by 5 o'clock, everybody's hair catches fire. Who does she think she is? And so women have to balance this, finding a just right between the not too nice and not too tough, which men don't even have to imagine dealing with.
Yeah. I think that one of the things that I've kind of felt for quite a long period of time is that one of the mistakes I think that women can make is trying to behave like the men, instead of actually just being the best version of themselves. But very often you see people. I've seen women kind of take on the behavior, the mannerism, the way of doing things that men do, and I think that actually undermines them rather than reinforces them. Would you share that view, or would you have a different view?
No, we agree with you entirely. In fact, in our first book, Breaking Through Bias, we go out of our way to make the point that women are fine just the way they are and should never try to behave like men, because it will only backfire.
Okay. So if you take that and say, okay, so women then should be the best version they can be, what's your advice to the woman? Because in order to survive, let's face it, male or female, to survive in the corporate world, you've got to be forceful, you've got to be dynamic, you've got to be all words that kind of fit into that. How do they do that without losing the essence of who they are?
Well, it turns out that the studies show that women who can balance the nice and kind and sweet with the let's get the job done actually perform better, get more promotions, stay longer at their organizations. And so one of the things that we do is we suggest that women can dip into the, just like you have a closet of clothes and you know what you're going to be doing today, you're going to pull out something different if you're going to an important meeting than you would if you were going to the beach. We all have the same characteristics of nice and kind and sweet and assertive and leadership role characteristics. And so women need to, unfortunately, in gender biased workplaces, which is most organizations, we need to figure out how we can demonstrate our competence, but at the same time, make it so that people don't feel that we're unlikable. And it's unfair and it's not, we'd like to see the world change. Men and organizations need to work towards solving these problems, but in a biased workplace, that's how women who make it can succeed.
I think it's important for women in particular to recognize that your phrase, the best possible version of themselves, is not always the same version. That is, we all have, as Andie points out, we all have multiple sides to our personality. We can all be forceful or welcoming. We can be gentle or assertive. And it is the ability to use that aspect of personality, character, in the right circumstance, in the right way, that is the key to women's success.
Yeah, I always think that because I mean, one of the things that I talk about when coaching and and coaching leaders, and you don't have to lead to have people reporting to you to be a leader, obviously.
Sure.
But one of the things that I think is really important is for people to, as a leader, you need to be somewhat chameleon-like. And sometimes the word chameleon has got a negative connotation. And I don't mean it in that way because I don't mean it to be manipulative or anything like that. But just you've got to be different with different people. If I'm leading somebody, I don't use the same version of me every single time because that's not going to work. And that's nothing to do with gender. It's just to do with, people are different. So you've got to find how you are and how you lean into that in different ways. So I would agree with that. One of the things that just struck me, and as we're talking there, the whole Me Too kind of recent, that's kind of got a lot of momentum in the last, short period of time. Do you think that has helped women in the corporate world, or has it been somewhat overplayed and maybe negative?
Well, it's really a combination of both. I mean, the fact that women are feeling empowered, that they can talk about some truly horrific behaviors that have been brushed under the rug for many years, is a really important step forward. The problem, though, is that what we're finding is that senior men and men who are in positions of helping and supporting women advance in their careers are basically saying to us, there's nothing in it for me to go out of my way to help a woman, for fear that somehow either she might accuse me or other people might suspect that there's something inappropriate about our relationship. And so that's the unfortunate part, that men pulling back when it's a time when we really need men to be out there working and helping and supporting women in their careers.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because I had a conversation recently with a company that I'm doing some work with, and I was talking to this guy. It was a guy, and he was talking about he's interviewing for a role, and there were three candidates, and two of which were men, and one of which was a woman. And he said, I'm kind of caught in a dilemma. He said, because he said, I actually genuinely believe that the best candidate is one of the two men, right? But he said, if I don't give it to the woman, I'm going to be accused of being biased. So he said he kind of found himself between a rock and a hard place. That no matter what way he went, He said if he selected a woman, in this case, he genuinely felt that she was not as well equipped for the role as the guy. And he said, and I just thought it was an interesting situation to find himself, that he kind of thought, I'm damned if I do and damned if I don't.
I think it's an interesting dilemma. The studies, in fact, however, show that when men make selection of the people that are going to work for them, they are judged competent regardless if they pick men or women. But that when women are the selectors and women are choosing, women are penalized if they pick another woman, because when women pick another woman, it is viewed as favoritism. So I think that the dilemma that we've seen play out far more is when women are in a position of power and asked to choose. We're not aware of the studies that show that men are penalized when they choose.
I think it was more a reflection that he was having himself, rather than him kind of pinpointing where he was going to get the blame.
But if you look at the world as a larger universe, where if the women are punished for picking a woman, then the men might feel that the guy is better for the job because he's more like him, or he reminds him of himself when he was a younger person. And so if he could assure that all of his bias was out of the picture as to why he was preferring the man, well, then he ought to pick the guy. Unfortunately, most of the research would show that he would be leaning towards a man for reasons that have nothing to do with their talent and competence, but just that he feels more comfortable with the man than he might with the woman.
I think, to be fair to the guy that I was talking about, I think he was actually quite genuine about it.
Okay.
And I think that he felt quite strong. One question, and just to throw in there, how much do you think, because this is kind of it's men, it's the problem lies there, and I'm not disagreeing with that, but how much do women contribute to the problem, if at all?
Well, women buy into the same stereotypes that men have about women, men, leaders, and families. And so, for example, what we find is that if a woman behaves in a forceful leadership way, it's not just the men who get upset, it's the women who get upset as well.
Yeah.
And so in our second book, It's Not You, It's the Workplace, what we did is we looked at the relationships between women in the workplace and what women could do to make certain that their relationships with other women, as well as with the other men, are as positive as possible. One other twist, though, is that because women buy into the stereotypes and biases, I started this journey of being concerned about gender diversity and communication when I served on my law firm's management committee and then our compensation committee. And what I found is that in the self-evaluations that women and men would write, the men would write about how terrific they were and how great they were and all the wonderful things that they'd done, and they were deserved $1 gazillion and a promotion. And the woman who had come up with the idea that had saved the client this huge amount of money was writing her self-evaluation. I was on the ABC team and I worked with so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so. Well, who do you think was making more money? Not the woman who was the one who had figured it all out. And so the very first thing that I did was self-evaluation do's and don'ts to let women know that we need to be more, we have to own our accomplishments, because if we don't own them, nobody's going to, they're not going to be recognized without our own acknowledgement of them.
Yeah, and it's interesting. You were talking there about the situation where it's it's the woman, the female leader, and women working with women. What is the research? Because we were talking about the bias in terms of being a female leader with having women reporting to you. What is do they experience the same bias or the same challenges as a male leader?
I think that the challenges for the female leaders are much tougher than they are for male leaders. For example, When women are working for men, they are used to and they expect those men to be decisive and firm and authoritative. If they work for a woman who behaves in precisely the same way, they can become resentful because that woman is not conforming to the kind, nice, sweet, caring stereotypes that that women have of other women. Women expect the women that they work for to be their friends, to be understanding of their personal problems, to go out of their way to be solicitous of their concerns. And when women are dynamic, creative, but direct leaders, they fall out of stereotype with the women that are working for them, and they can run into real problems in having positive relationships with those women.
And hence you actually get the comments about bitchiness that goes on in
Exactly,
the workplace.
exactly. When in fact, what prompted us to write our second book, the It's Not You, It's the Workplace, was because a woman said, I get along fine with the guys, but I hate working with women. So asked her why she felt that way. And she said, well, women are great. And the men are great. They're fun to work with, but the women, they're such bitches. They're nasty. They're evil. They only care about themselves. And I specifically said to her, can you tell me some of the ways that the women who you worked for treated you differently from the ways that the men did? And she was not able to come up with any differences in the way they treated each other. And finally, she looked up at me. I wasn't sure if she was conscious. She was quiet for so long. She looked up and with sort of tears running down her eyes, she said, they treated me exactly the same. And I ruined their careers because she went to their boss and said, I'm not working with those women. They're nasty.
Wow, that's pretty powerful, isn't it?
It was she had a little epiphany.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, we've talked about the problems because what we're talking about here are, deeply held beliefs that have been, perpetuated by your environment, by probably upbringing, everything else, and by the culture. Because one of the things in the workplace is that the one thing that I've always observed is that, and this is an appalling generalization, I accept, but for men in the workplace, they kind of fit in, and they kind of naturally fit in, and it becomes part of their identity. Now that's got positive and negative connotations to that, but for women, it's actually tougher to fit in. And that would be an observation that they have to work harder, where it seems a much more natural progression for men to fit in. So if we're talking about that's the problem, and we talked about the issues and the challenges. So what do we need to do to bring about this change? Because it's an organizational, it's a societal, it's familial, it's all of those. How do we bring about this change?
Well, the problem that you're talking about, that is the fitting in problem, is because the workplace, by and large, in most organizations, is run by men, and it is dominated by masculine norms, values, and expectations. The ethos of corporate world all over the Western world is one that has been created by men to fit into men's way of doing things. Now, that means that there is a separation between work and the rest of people's lives. It means that the men have an expectation that someone else in their life will take care of the domestic problems when they arise. And it is an expectation that careers won't be interrupted. And for women to fit into that world, they need to find a way to adapt to that masculine culture. Now, you asked, how do we change that? Well, our thought, and we've thought a lot about this, is it's the only way we're going to change it is not by talking about it, but by getting a critical mass of women into organizational senior leadership. So that is a little bit of a catch-22. That is, how do you get a critical mass of women into leadership if, in fact, the leadership is hostile to women coming up? So we lay out what we think is a comprehensive program for achieving that. But the bottom line is that cultures aren't going to change unless there are more women running them.
So what are we going to do to change this? I mean, I accept that it's a
Well,
big challenge, for all the talk over the last 25 years, there's been very little change, hasn't there?
well, the last 50 years has been very
Yeah.
little change, unfortunately. Well, basically, there's three trains that have to leave the station at the same time. One is what women can do today in gender biased workplaces to overcome or avoid the obstacles that are put in their way of making them feel like outsiders. So, for example, women need to have a sense of humor about these wacky things. I be the only woman at meetings for decades, and uh, what was that? Well, I was the odd platypus out. So I have a platypus collection where everybody who ever goes any place, fortunately, it's not like hippos or something where you could get 1,000,000 a day. It's a manageable collection. But the joke is that, you find a way of navigating through the difficult situations. You pull a different characteristic out of your wardrobe of characteristics, depending on how you have to interact. The second train that's leaving the station is what men need to do. And for them, education is an important first step, but it's not going to solve the problem because we are biased. And as much as we talk a good game about, I see my bias and I conquer it, the reality is it's very difficult. And so they need to put themselves in the shoes of women to see what it's like, what the problems are, to be able to make some changes. And then organizations need to change their policies and procedures to take the bias out of promotion, compensation, career enhancing characteristics, and that's what we actually have, a 7-step program that we've got in It's Not You, It's the Workplace, of what organizations need to do in order to get bias out of the decision-making process, because we can't rely on the good conscience and good faith of people. We need to get bias out of the evaluation process.
I think it's important that Andie didn't say we're going to eliminate bias. We're never going to eliminate bias. It's there. It's it's sort of baked into us and from small children. What we do need, however, are processes and procedures that interrupt that bias, that stop it from affecting our career affecting decisions. And that's what we're focused on. How can organizations, that third train, how can organizations structure their decision making processes so that they prevent the biases that the decision makers have and are not going to get rid of? How do they structure those processes and procedures so that those biases won't influence their decisions? That's the trick.
And that's a big challenge for the organization. And I
It's an
suppose
enormous challenge.
huge, yeah. So it kind of begs the question to you, and from your experience as experts in this space, there's a lot of talk and a lot of kind of verbiage that you hear organizations bounce around the place about all of this and diversity and everything else. Do you believe that in the corporate, a major corporate world, there is a real will to do this, or is it just words?
Well, if you measure will by the amount of money that's being spent, there's will. That is, that corporations are spending an enormous amount on what is called anti-bias training or diversity work. But is there a will in the sense that it's a corporate priority, that it is right up at the top with customer satisfaction profitability and quality products? Absolutely not.
No.
Absolutely not. So we think that there's an enormous amount of money that's being spent largely on worthless efforts, largely in an effort to say, look at us, we're doing the right thing, pat me on the back. But if in fact we look at what progress has been made as a result of all of those dollars being spent, all of those training sessions, all, as you point out, almost nothing has happened.
Yeah. I mean, is so in a sense that would say to me that it's a bit of a box ticking exercise by many companies because they've got to be seen to do it. So is the change going to happen in those large corporates, or is it going to be driven from elsewhere in industry? Because I was talking to a company that I do some work with, and it's a privately owned business, and it's actually it's another husband and wife gig like you guys, and but they own the business, and it's quite a substantial business, but they have a real passion about making this happen. So I suppose my question is it organized? Is it going to come from organizations like that that's going to influence and push the influence up? Because I just not sure that I see it coming from the major global corporations.
Well, I think you're right, but that doesn't get the global organizations off the hook. And
No.
so what needs to happen is there needs to be pressure from outside. Their vendors, they may have policies that they have to have a certain number of women on their management teams, or they have to, even if it's box checking, it forces them to, sort of put a commitment behind the mission statement that everybody has on their corporate website.
Yeah, but Andy, is that not a bit of tokenism? I mean, that we got to have a number of women, and then for the women that then achieve those, they're not sure whether they've got there on merit or because they're just making up the quota.
I think you're right, but I think what can overcome that is a real conviction that by increasing the number of women in management, in senior leadership, corporations will do better. They will make more money. They will be more innovative. They will be more creative. And that message is what's going to convince those major corporations that they need to take this more seriously.
And the studies do show that that's in fact the case.
But I don't think that there are very many corporations that really believe that they can do better by increasing the diversity of their leadership. I think they pay lip service to that, but I don't think when they go to sleep at night, they believe it.
It's interesting because we were just talking before we started the interview. I mean, certainly my experience of working with companies and with senior leadership teams is that the teams that have got greater potential to be really high performing teams are teams where there is that diversity. If it's an all male team, it tends to be hard work to embed change, and in every team, it's about change of one sort or another. Whereas the kind of the mix of energy facilitates that change. So I think it's actually there's a commercial reality. It's not just about the right and the morality of it or anything like that. I think there's also a commercial reality, and I think the challenge is to get organizations to appreciate the commercial reality that having that diversity in a leadership team will actually bring to the business, which is kind of coming back to the point that you make. I think it's a very real issue. I had a conversation in an elevator very not too long ago. I was going up in an organization, and it's an organization I've done some work in, but very successful, quite dynamic, quite male dominated. But I was going in up the lift with a very senior executive. She's and very, very talented in the organization. And just before we got to the where we're going to the meeting, she said to me, she said, I am just so nervous because she said, I'm going into this meeting and it was 4:30 in the afternoon. She said, I've got to be out of there at 5 because I've got to go and pick up my child. And I do not want to say that's why I'm leaving.
Right, of course. Of course. A guy can say, I have to go pick up my child, and everybody jumps into applause. He's such a great dad. The mom says she has to leave, then she's a loser. So, sure.
So if you're looking at it, what are your, let me reverse it, because I was going to do this the other way around. Let me reverse it. If you're talking to men, because, men have a big role to play in this, let's be honest about it. What would be your top tips to the men?
I think the number one is to recognize how much harder it is for women to make it than it is for men. Lots of men will say, oh, I know about bias, but I'm not biased. My organization isn't biased. I work for a pure meritocracy. Anybody can make it here just as easily as anybody else. Well, we've got to break through that.
That's just an organization where they all have the same bias.
Yeah,
that's right, clearly, because they all look alike.
So, the first tip for men is get over the notion that you're working in a meritocracy. You aren't. Nobody is. And when those biases are recognized to be operative and holding women back, then men can begin to confront reality. The next thing is, if they do recognize that those biases are hindering women's advancement, that they can take small steps to reach out to individual women, to coach them, to put them on their teams, to say good things about them, to protect them in meetings when they are interrupted, to make sure that their ideas are listened to. Men can do a lot when they recognize that women have got a tougher road to hoe than they do.
Can I ask you one thing, just on those, and you just thought of it when you were talking there? Is there a challenge? And I just seen it come up once or twice. The challenge of men mentoring women. Is there any sense that has become an issue either in the men's mind or in the women's mind?
Well, Andie mentioned when you were talking about the Me Too movement, what we've seen is that the men mentoring women has fallen back, that there's been a much greater reluctance now for men to take on that role. And I suppose to some degree, there is a reluctance by women to be in one-on-one situations with senior men. So we think, and we know of many situations in which male mentors of females has been very, very positive. But we are seeing and can be, and we encourage it. But what we're seeing is that a great deal of reluctance since 2017 to pursue that.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the downsides of the Me Too, that people are just nervous of being in an environment where they can be accused of doing something, whether it happened or whether it didn't.
Absolutely.
And I think that is a risk. Can I flip it over and say, okay, so what to the women executives? What are your tips to them in the current world?
Well, they really have to have two sets of conversations. The first one is conversations with themselves about what they need to do to succeed, grit, positive mindset. Most of the women that, if not all of the women that make it to senior leadership are able to dust themselves off, pick themselves up, and try it again. Those are the kinds of conversations that women need to have with themselves. And then in the conversations that they have with others, they need to balance the nice and kind and sweet with the I'm competent and I'm going to get the job done. And so there's a impression management element that women have to think about, which men don't need to, but in fact, by the time they're 3 or 4 years old, they've learned how to play the politics game that women are not trained in as small girls and as a general rule. And so women need to keep in mind the conversations that they're going to have with other people, primarily because they're not going to be able to change the biases of the people that they're interacting with. So instead, they have to find a way either to work their way around that or to confront it in a way that allows the business process to go forward and to give them the opportunities that they deserve.
I think I was one of those few young boys that was brainwashed by women because I grew up with a very powerful mother,
Uh-huh.
2 older sisters, my wife, and my 3 daughters, all of whom have pretty strong personalities. So I've always been, even the dog was female.
Yes.
So I've been very dominated by that.
Well, good for you.
Good man.
Well, I think I was probably brainwashed in another way, so it probably it didn't do me any harm either. Listen, this is a fascinating subject, and your expertise on this is brilliant, and I'd love to come back and have another conversation. Before we wrap up, and you can tell people where they can reach out and contact you. Question I ask everybody: I know you're authors of books, but if you could pick a book one that you haven't written yourselves that had a significant impact upon you, what would it be, and why did it have that impact?
Well, there's a book called Fly Girls, which is about the first women aviators in the 1920s and the 30s. And that was a fabulous book, not just to see the involvement that women had, but it encouraged me to check out a host of other books about women who were breakthroughs. And so there's a book called Code Girls and Rocket Girls, and they're all great. They're all great books. So getting a chance to see how women have navigated and clearly traditionally male workplaces is a positive, fun, feel good kind of thing for women. So I'd recommend starting with Fly Girls.
And obviously they can also pick up your own book, which is Breaking Through Bias. And I think it is just worth a mention that is something that is from 2 people who have got deep experience in this subject matter. And I think it is fantastic. And the other question I ask everybody is about daily rituals, if you have them, and what they are.
Well, I suppose the daily ritual that I care most about is that since we were first married, Andie and I have made a point to always have dinner together if we're in the same city. And that was true when our daughter was growing up. We would always have dinner as a family. The notion that we would eat separately or at different times was just not in our program. So that when we would always be certain that we left work in time to be with our daughter, to have dinner with her, to have dinner as a family, to sit down. That didn't mean that we wouldn't go back to work after dinner. Of course we did. As lawyers, work never ends. But that time, that dinner time, has always been precious to us. And now, even with our daughter gone, we make a point that we sit down together, we talk, we have dinner together.
That is fantastic. Do you mind me asking how long you've been married?
Well, more than 30 years.
31 years.
Wow, congratulations. So it's obviously a good recipe for longevity in marriage.
Absolutely.
That's great. Andie and Al, this has been great. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. It's a subject matter that I've great passion and interest in, and it's been a real joy to have you. I want to thank you for being a guest on the Winning Teams podcast. Where can people reach out and get in touch with you? We'll put everything in the show notes, but just if you can tell them now.
Sure. Our website is andieandal.com. And the only complicated part of it is that I spell Andie, A-N-D-I-E. So it's A-N-D-I-E. ANDAL, andieandal.com. And the joke we've been told lately is that people are starting to say Andie and Al is one word. So
that's called branding, and that's called successful branding. Right. So you should be proud of that. Listen, may I say thank you again. It's been a real pleasure, a real joy. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to talking to you real soon.
Thank you. We enjoyed it. Thank you for having us.
Pleasure.